Christian apologists want us to believe that the Book of Acts is reliable.
Acts?
Acts.
Very reliable, yep.
I got it from a reliable source. What?
He needs the axe.
Nice axe.
Axe.
Axe, Cheyenne. Axe.
How reliable?
It came from a less than reliable source.
Not the most reliable source.
Of course it's from a reliable source, you blonde-headed boob!
But is it?
If you have credible information from a reliable source, I want to know it, and I want to know it now.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, we're pleased to be joined again by friend of the channel, renowned scholar, Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, so I'm not here to promote a course today.
Nice.
I'm here to promote a conference.
Of course.
Next to Jesus, Paul is the most important figure in the history of Christianity, but he's widely misunderstood by the general public, but also among many scholars, many of us. I'm Bart Ehrman, and I'd like to announce new insights into the New Testament, a biblical conference for those who are not scholars. We have a fantastic lineup of 10 internationally known scholars, each of whom will be giving a lecture with Q&A to follow. Some of these talks will be presenting alternative understandings to Paul, that is, alternative to what most of us have long thought and even taught. Paul was not a monotheist, calling into question Paul's authentic letters. Paul maintained that a person is saved by their works. For Paul, Jesus wasn't the only figure to be exalted and glorified. Paul's understandings of Paul's views of sex and sexuality. Paul was heavily influenced by non-Christian, non-Jewish Greek philosophy. Paul's radical reimagining of time mixed signals on Paul's view of the law. Paul was taking a collection in order to keep Christianity from breaking into two different religions. Paul saw himself as the one described by Isaiah the prophet who was chosen to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. As you can see, it's quite a lineup with very interesting topics and superb scholars and good speakers.
To learn more about the conference, go to tinyurl.com/BartCon2024.
I hope to see you there.
Well, more on that later on, but today we're going to be looking at some claims from Dr. Craig Keener, a prolific author, well known for his massive 2-volume set on miracles and his 4-volume commentary on the Book of Acts. But due to time considerations, we're going to take a look at a short video from Keener on the historicity of the Book of Acts.
There are a minority of scholars who treat Acts as a novel, but most scholars don't treat it that way. For one thing, ancient novels were normally romances, a feature that is notoriously lacking in the Book of Acts. There were a minority of historical novels in antiquity, but never, to my knowledge, and you know, I've read enough that I can say certainly it would have to be extremely rarely, if there are any, of these involved characters within living memory. So not somebody from the very recent past, as we have in the case of the Book of Acts. But another reason that we can't see it as a novel is that there are just too many external correspondences with what we know from ancient history. This is what fits a work of history, not a novel.
I think that there have been scholars like Richard Purvo and others who have wanted to argue that Acts is more like an ancient novel. And we have a number of novels from the ancient world. We call them novels. There are 5 that we have in Greek that are fairly long, one full one and a couple of others in Latin. They're fictional accounts. And Purvo's point is that the Book of Acts has many of the same themes and, works kind of like a novel in some way. But on this one, I agree with Keener. This is not a novel. Novels really they're purely fiction. They're not about human beings who actually lived. And I think the Book of Acts is really better understood as an attempt at history. Where Keener and I are going to disagree is whether it's history in the sense that we today would think of it, but it's not a fictional work in the sense that a novel is, an ancient novel is.
And of course, one could give very many of these, but just for a handful. Felix was the Roman governor at just the right time that you would expect from the Book of Acts. And although Felix was married to 3 different princesses at different times, the princess to whom he's married in the Book of Acts, Drusilla, was the princess to whom he was actually married at the time that the book was written. Festus and Herod Agrippa I both act in character with what we know of them. Agrippa II, who's mentioned in Acts 25 and 26, is there with his sister Bernice. Now, Bernice only stayed with Agrippa during certain periods of time, and the period of time that Acts gets is exactly the right period. Now, these are not the kinds of things a novelist would bother to have researched from what we know of ancient novelists. These are the kinds of things that we would find instead in a work of ancient historiography. One work that actually deals with these correspondences with external history has over 100 pages of this kind of material.
The question isn't whether the author thought he was being accurate or not. The question is whether the author was accurate or not. So I don't really quite understand what that argument is. But there's another problem with it, which is that if you're dealing with the accuracy of the author of Acts, so it's an account of the spread of Christianity for its first 30 years or so. The first 12 chapters focus on a historical figure, Peter. The second 2/3 of the book is about a historical figure, Paul. And there's certainly historical information in there about both of those figures. But it sounds like Keener is pulling it's kind of a trick that a lot of people pull, especially evangelical scholars, when it comes to the New Testament, that if there are details in a text that can be verified, for example, a geographical location or the date or the name of somebody, that you can show that those dates or those geographical locations of those somebodies actually existed, then the conclusion they draw is, therefore, the account is accurate. That's borderline crazy. Are you kidding? Somebody today can absolutely write an account of, say, of me or of you. You know, they can write an account of Bart Ehrman teaching at University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in the year, 2014, that he taught a class on the introduction to the New Testament, and he went to Hamilton Hall in order to teach this class. But before he got to Hamilton Hall, the hall had been blown up. There was a gas explosion, and it blown up the entire house, and 300 people were killed. Okay, well, they got my name right, they got the date right, they got the place right, Chapel Hill is right, Hamilton is where I was teaching the class, they have all the details right. The story is flat out wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And so when it comes to the book of Acts, we're not talking about whether he knew that there was an Agrippa, or if he knew that there really was a place called Thessalonica or something. Of course, he's writing in his time, and he's putting these people in their historical context. So it doesn't mean that the story is accurate.
Paul's letters are a major source of external corroboration for the book of Acts. You have some differences because, Luke is not Paul, but you have so many correspondences. For example, the names in Paul's circle, not only major characters like, of course, Peter and so on, but also a wide range of minor characters. The role of Barnabas fits, the role of Silas fits, the role of Timothy fits. Paul being let down from a wall in a basket at Damascus is attested both in Acts and in Paul's own writings. You have a fairly exact itinerary where they both mention the same points, quite a large number of points. Paul is converted near Damascus, and then the rest of his life, Jerusalem, Syria, Cilicia, and the different cities that he visits one after the other. Even Paul's travel plans that are mentioned in Acts 19, where he plans to go to Macedonia, Greece, and then Jerusalem, and then Rome, are also his travel plans and his letters, and how things are fulfilled in his letters. So many correspondences on that level.
The problem with knowing if history is accurate, whether a story is accurate, the problem is not whether it has some things that are accurate. The question is whether it has some things that are inaccurate. And so suppose, somebody tells a story about you in this case, and 60% of what they say can be verified, and that it's things kind of public knowledge. But they're telling a story about you where you tell the same story somewhere else, and 40% of it is absolutely contrary to what you say. Mm-hmm. Well, you can't take the 60% and say, well, it's accurate, and therefore the whole thing is accurate. You have to evaluate each and every part. And so the fact that there are things that do line up between Paul and Acts is good, and it's worth noting. Historians need to take note of this, and they do, that there are a number of aspects of Paul's letters where he mentions things in his life that the book of Acts also mentions, and there are many broad similarities. And so that is absolutely worth knowing. But it doesn't show that the book of Acts is accurate in any substantial sense. It says that it has some good overlap with some places that show general accuracy about some things.
That is precisely the major objection that people have raised against Luke really being a traveling companion, and against taking we the way we would take it everywhere else in ancient historiography. people say, well, he thinks differently. But if you compare biographies of ancient figures with the letters that those figures wrote, you have a situation that's very comparable to what we have with Acts and Paul's letters. And the evidence is pretty much the same. You know, people wrote from their own perspectives that could be different from this person's perspective, but it still can include a great deal of accurate information. The differences exist, but they're often exaggerated. One of the major differences that people argue between Paul and his letters and the book of Acts is that Acts presents Paul much more favorably towards the law. But these scholars are arguing from a view that's now been mostly discredited, that Paul was really against the law. That's not the view that most scholars hold. I mean, there are a range of views related to Paul and the law, but most scholars don't hold that Paul was against the law. Most scholars would not hold that Paul is against the customs of his people at this point. Also, when you take a speech like Acts 20, which is in the We material, and it's Paul's one speech to believers, which fits what we have in Paul's letters, there we find considerable correspondences, often even in particular language, even though ancient historians didn't have to get the language just exactly verbatim. That wasn't expected in ancient speeches because you didn't have tape recorders. But sometimes even the language is very similar to Paul's letters. There are differences, but the differences are what you would expect because nobody is saying that Paul wrote the book of Acts.
I would have to see specifically what he's talking about, what specific details he's referring to, because those are just generalities. They don't give us anything. That Paul's preaching to believers in one case and non-believers in another. Yes, that's true. So what? I mean, what about that reconciles the difference between Acts chapter 17 and Romans chapter 1? In other words, what about the fact that he's preaching to non-believers solves that problem? And if he is, and it's true, he is preaching to non-believers, but Keener probably does not point out that when Paul preaches to non-believers in the book of Acts, in order to convert them, he says nothing about the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, that Jesus was for your sins, that he had to shed his blood for your sins. That's an interesting take on Paul, that he doesn't preach atonement. He preaches that God will forgive you if you repent, not that Jesus' death brought an atonement. And who are Paul? He's all about atonement. Paul doesn't talk about forgiveness. He talks about the God, says, okay, and so, you're sorry. Okay, great. I'll just forgive you now. It's not like it. Jesus has to die on the cross. And Paul does not have a doctrine of the cross in the book of Acts. That's a rather big difference.
Wow.
When ancient historians used we, they almost always meant, we or I, they almost always meant that they were present when they're describing it within the events of the narrative. Sir Arthur Darby Knock, one of the most outstanding classicists of the 20th century, pointed out that as far as he could recall, there was at most one example in all of ancient historiography where a writer used the first person and didn't mean that they were actually present. Now, of course, in novels and so on, you have that. But if it's a historical work, some people have said, well, he wasn't really there when he says we. It's just fictitious. If a person were going to make up their presence, you'd think they'd make it up at Jesus' resurrection or at Pentecost or some major event like that. But Luke implies his presence only when he's traveling with Paul. Only when he has to mention himself because he was there. Also, it's geographically isolated. That is, it's not everywhere, not even everywhere that Paul travels. But when Paul travels from Troas to Philippi in Acts chapter 16, at that point, it says we. And then when Paul leaves Philippi, there's no we for many years until Paul comes back to Philippi, and then the we picks up again. Presumably the author stayed in Philippi. And then we continues through most of the rest of the book of Acts. The final quarter of Acts deals especially with Paul in Roman custody, and Luke was apparently with him during that time. That is a period of at least 2 years. So it gives considerable time for Luke to, and part of it was in Judea, so it gives Luke considerable time to have interviewed eyewitnesses, as he mentions in Luke chapter 1, and considerable time to have talked with Paul and learned about events and experiences that actually preceded even the time that Luke was with him.
I have a very long discussion of the we passages my discussion came out after Keener wrote his multi-volume commentary on Acts. And so he wouldn't have read my discussion before he wrote it. I don't know if he's read it since, but I explain why the we passages absolutely don't show that this author was one of Paul's companions. And I come up with a couple of pages of parallel examples where this happens, where people use we. They'll be telling a narrative and they'll use we or I in order to validate the narrative. And so I have a lot of examples of that. There are a couple of things surprising about these we passages. One is they come out of nowhere. The first one is in chapter 16. And the author does not say something like, well, then I joined Paul and we started doing this, that, or the other thing. The author through the entire book up to this point has been talking about Paul and his companions. They. And then all of a sudden, like without saying anything about it, all of a sudden it's we. What? And then the we stops like in the middle of the sentence virtually. He's like, he doesn't say, and then I left and they. It's like, then all of a sudden it's they. It's like, what in the world? And so this is a very strange thing. And so that's one reason why many scholars for a long time have said that what's really going on is that the author has access to some kind of itinerary of somebody who was a companion of Paul. And that there's a fragmentary travelogue of somebody was taking notes when he was with him, and the author just had these fragments, he just stuck it in there in places as appropriate. I used to think that, I used to teach that, but now I'm convinced that's completely wrong too. I'm not as completely wrong as completely wrong that this person was a companion of Paul. This person clearly was not a companion of Paul. He doesn't know what Paul preached. He gets mistakes about where Paul was, when, and with whom. I mean, the mistakes are all over the place. And so it doesn't seem to have been a companion. And what I argue in the book, Forgery and Counterforgery, that these we passages are used to make people think that the author was a companion of Paul. And Keener and people like him would say, well, it's kind of a boring place to put it in. And he doesn't make a big deal of it. And if he really wanted to emphasize that he was a companion, he would have really emphasized it. He just kind of has these 4 passages. And my response to that is, think about that for a second. You're telling me that Luke would have been more successful if he had emphasized it more? How successful could he be? For the last 2,000 years, everybody has said is written by a companion of Paul. He's brilliantly successful. You wanted him to be more successful? And so it just doesn't understand how authors write books like this when they try to inject a first-person pronoun in. And again, as I say, I've got a lot of examples of these in my book. And no, it does not show that he was a traveling companion, and there are all sorts of reasons for knowing that he was not a traveling companion.
History was written differently than history today. And of course, we can't judge ancient historians by a genre that didn't yet exist. But of course, the modern historiography developed from ancient historiography. Even the critical methodologies developed from ancient historians, like Polybius, for example. But ancient historians were very concerned with information, and not only historians, but other writers also. Pliny, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, spoke of the responsibility of historians to deal in factual information. At the same time, they presented the information differently than we do today. They were more interested in moral or political or even theological lessons. They saw that as part of their responsibility to guide the reader to interpret the events in the right way. So, the fact that we're dealing with interpretive history in the New Testament doesn't make it any less history. That's the way history was written back then, and it makes it more edifying. Also, historians were interested in scenes, in fleshing out scenes. For example, in Acts chapter 25, you have Agrippa and Bernice and the Roman governor Festus discussing the case of Paul. Well, Luke wasn't there. How does Luke know what happened? Well, on the next day, they talk about how they discussed this. So the difference between an ancient historian and a modern historian is that an ancient historian might see it as their literary responsibility to flesh it out as a scene. Luke did have information there. It's public knowledge the next day. But Luke can flesh it out as a scene in a way that a modern historian wouldn't feel comfortable doing.
Did you say Aristotle, Pliny, and Cicero as historians?
He said those were other writers who spoke about historians.
Well, of course, but they're not writing histories.
Right.
Aristotle's a philosopher. So I don't know what he's talking about. Aristotle didn't write histories. Whoever wrote Acts is writing histories. Now, he could have mentioned Plutarch, for example, who is writing biographies, and Plutarch's biographies are trying to teach moral lessons. And Plutarch tells us that his biographies are not just meant to be names and dates, They're meant to provide moral lessons. They, too, though, are widely considered to be problematic as pure historical sources. But not only that, the author of Acts doesn't go that route. He claims he's writing a historically accurate account. And so he doesn't have even the same function as Plutarch. And Plutarch, there are problems with him, too. You can't just take everything he says as being factually accurate. And Plutarch, at least, is balanced. Plutarch will say, some people say this, some say that, but I think probably this is what happened. And for Acts, man, it is like, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. And, a lot of times he's wrong based on just reading other sources. The author of Luke Acts is also the one he wrote the book of Luke, the account that says that King Herod was the king when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and this Caesar Augustus had a worldwide census that everybody had to register for throughout the Roman world. And he just said, wow, that's a historian? What kind of history is that? It's the same guy who wrote Acts, and he's got also things in Acts they're just not accurate.
Excellent. Well, that basically covers Keener's arguments in this video. I know that earlier this year, you actually had a debate on the reliability of Acts against a young upstart called Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, so my undergraduates all have to do a debate. It's like they have a small group, and so each person is in like a 3-person group, a debate team, and they research them in front of their other colleagues and stuff. And so most of them have not been involved with debate before, and so I model a debate for them. I do this every year, and the debate resolutions resolve the book of Acts is historically reliable. And so I get up, and I'm wearing a hat and a sport coat, and I get up and I give the first affirmative speech, and I argue why the book of Acts is historically reliable. I give that speech, and then I take off my hat, take off my sport coat, and put on something else, and then I give the negative speech arguing why the book of Acts is not reliable and why this affirmative person doesn't know what he's talking about. Then I give the negative rebuttal to what the affirmative person said, then I give the affirmative rebuttal to what the negative person said, and I go back and forth like this for an hour. It's a lot of fun. So I know all the arguments. I mean, I used to believe these arguments. So what Keener is saying, things that I believed when I was a fundamentalist at Moody Bible Institute. So I'm very familiar with these arguments. And I just think they're not right. They're just specious. And so if you want to know if something's accurate, you don't want to look just at the similarities. You do want to look at those. You want to look at the differences. You want to look at the contradictions. You want to look at the mistakes. And you start piling those up with Acts. Forget about Luke, just the book of Acts. And it's clear that, of course, he gets some things right, but there are a lot of things that are absolutely not right. Some of them are big things, and boy, there are a lot of little things.
Well, the star of Acts is the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul is also the star of the upcoming 2024 edition of the New Insights into the New Testament Conference. It's 10 internationally renowned scholars that no college student would ever have access to all at once in 2 days. This isn't going to be a greatest hits from these scholars. You've challenged them all to bring brand new material, new to the public, and sometimes new to the world, all challenging us to learn more about Paul and rethink preconceptions about Paul. Besides the lectures, there are Q&As, there's a student mixer the night before, there are VIP perks to interact even more with the speakers, lifetime access to the lectures, shockingly low prices for the value, and so on. But all that said, what should we be most excited about?
Well, I'm really excited about it. That doesn't mean everybody else should be. I mean, I'm excited about a lot of things people don't care about, but this one's pretty important. I mean, if anyone's interested in the history of Christianity or Christianity itself, the teachings of Christianity, how Christianity became a major religion, but also, where these beliefs developed, who's more important than the Apostle Paul? Answer, no one. And so we're going to have 10 presentations by 10 internationally known scholars who are experts on Paul, who are presenting their knowledge at a layperson's level, so that people are going to be hearing stuff, a lot of stuff they've never heard before, never even thought of before, and at their level that they're going to understand it. And these are really good presenters. They're not only like brilliant scholars, they're also really good presenters. And so, I mean, next to Jesus, if you're interested in Christianity, Paul's the guy, and this conference is going to be dealing with that at a high level, but at a level that everybody's going to be understand and appreciate.
To sign up for the New Insights into the New Testament Conference, even if you're watching this video after it happened, go to tinyurl.com/BartCon2024 or use the link in the description. And if you use those links, you'll not only be getting incredible learning at a great price, you'll also be supporting the mission of this channel. And for that, I'm very grateful. Bart, thank you for joining us today, and I can't wait to see you at the conference.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
For more of a former Christian, taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.